Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I'm your host, Steve. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support The History of the Papacy by going to the website a2zhistorypage.com. Speaking of supporting the show, Patreon is a great way to do that. We're at patreon.com/history of the papacy. You well know the tiers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. They each have their own privileges and rights, and the best privilege and right is that you will be included on the History of the Papacy Diptychs. A fun fact about the College of Cardinals is that the bird cardinal of North America, bright red bird, is named after cardinals. So fun fact. Now, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy Diptychs. We have Roberto Yoren William Bryan, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, and William H. at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, and John, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Leonard the Great, and Alex the Great. As you well know, we are a member of the Patrion Podcast Network, featuring Richard Lim's This American President podcast, among many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. Today's episode is something a little bit different. I am presenting you with two short bonus episodes that up to this point were only available to patrons of the show on patreon.com/history of the papacy. I publish bonus content regularly, but you can only get it on Patreon. Occasionally, I will share some of these episodes on the public feed to give you a little taste of what's going on over at Patreon. And if the topic of the bonus content fits in with the series, which it does in this case, it's a win-win. Today's bonus content is a short conversation I had with Gil Kedron of A Podcast of Biblical Proportions on his experiences as a native speaker of Hebrew while reading the Old Testament. The second episode is a short introduction to the Second Temple Egyptian Jewish theologian, philosopher, and politician Philo of Alexandria. Philo's work had a huge impact on early Christianity. He even likely lived during the time of Jesus. Patreon is a great way if you want to support the show and keep the History of the Papacy as a going concern and sustainable for long in the future. So I would definitely love it if you would consider becoming a patron. And as well as I hope you enjoy this bit of bonus content. And if you want more, you can find more on Patreon. With that, here's the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome back to the History of the Papacy in 10 minutes, or less. At least we try, definitely no more than 15 minutes. Decline and fall and extinction of language is the usual life cycle of a language. It almost never goes the other way, from death to rebirth. Hebrew is one of the biggest examples of a language that flipped that trend on its head. And in a way, it might be the only example of a language that's flipped the trend. In this bonus episode of the History of the Papacy in 10 Minutes podcast, I talked with Gil Kedron of A Podcast of Biblical Proportions about his experience as a native speaker of Hebrew. Before we get to Gil and my conversation on Hebrew, I thought I'd share a little background on the 3,000-year-old history of this most biblical of languages. Let's go back to Hebrew's ancient origins. Several thousand years ago, part of the Northwest Semitic branch of the Afro-Semitic language family broke off and kind of started its own thing. That was Hebrew. The Hebrew developed within the Canaanite branch of this family. Hebrew is very similar to ancient Canaanite and Phoenician in many ways. And in a lot of ways, it's indistinguishable from them, obviously with its own flair. Hebrew developed a writing system based on the Phoenician alphabet. Both of these languages had no vowel markers, though. Vowels needed to be understood from context in order to be read. So you would see a consonant cluster and a reader would know where the vowels were supposed to fit in. That makes things interesting for modern scholars trying to read these documents, but it's not quite as complicated as it might seem, especially coming from a Indo-European language where vowels play more of a role in how words are developed. But that's neither here nor there. Hebrew was the spoken and written language of the Judeans and Israelites until about 200 BC. They wrote the Bible in it, wrote a lot of the Bible in it, spoke it, etc., did liturgical rites in Hebrew. After that time, though, the lingua franca of the Middle East became Aramaic, another Semitic language, similar enough to Hebrew, but definitely its own thing. And Aramaic took on more popularity. So, for example, Jesus in the early part of the Common Era spoke Aramaic, not Hebrew as his day-to-day language. At this point, Hebrew essentially died as a spoken language. It remained a literary and liturgical language, of course, though. Hebrew was well and truly dead, though, as a spoken language. And compare that to, say, Latin. Latin never really died as a spoken language. Classical Latin was frozen in time, but the spoken language of vulgar Latin, the language of the people, slowly changed into Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, Walloon, Vlach, or hundreds of other languages. It just, over time, languages change. This common tongue of vulgar Latin slowly changed. One in Wallonia changed into Walloon. In Romania, it got separated from the body of other Romance languages and kind of did its own thing. That's just a natural progress of language. Hebrew didn't do this, though. It stayed locked in time. Hebrew was used liturgically, but as a liturgical language, not as a spoken language, and that's different. Jews spoke the local language of where they lived. If they were in Spain, they spoke Spanish. In Germany, they spoke German. In England or the United States, they spoke English. A lot of them in the Middle East kept speaking Aramaic. They also spoke Arabic, you name it. Jews around the world used liturgical Hebrew in their prayers, reading Torah, the Mishnah, and other texts. They also spiced up their spoken language, such as English, German, etc., with different, what you might call Hebrewisms. They would put in little bits of Hebrew idiom into their language. There was so much spicing up that the languages the Jews spoke can, in some cases, almost be considered a separate language. Yiddish, for example. Yiddish is very close to modern standard German. It's different enough that if you really truly want to speak Yiddish, you have to learn it. You have to learn slightly different pronunciations. You have to learn idioms, etc. The next phase of Hebrew is in the early Middle Ages. A group of Jewish scholars, the Masoretes, codified Hebrew scriptures and made some minor but important reforms to Hebrew, particularly written Hebrew, mainly by creating a better way to mark the vowels in the written language called diacritics. Again, that's a deep dive that we really don't need to get into, but what'll be important for today in my conversation with Gil is that in the 19th century, there was a revival of Jewish identity and Jewish nationalism, and that led to a revival of Hebrew. We see this in other places too with other languages. People starting to think more about their local languages and not get flooded over so much by the big ones like Spanish that had gone all over the place. English, you get the drift. The idea of Zionism, or the return of the Jewish diaspora to Palestine, is on the upswing as well. A scholar named Eliezer ben Yehuda developed a spoken version of Hebrew. He was a Jew born in Eastern Europe and lived in different parts of Eastern Europe. He's one of these polymath kind of guys who comes out of the 19th century who seemingly can do everything, and they almost do everything. For him, he wanted to invent or bring back this dead language, and it was a brilliant exercise. Yehuda led salons and clubs of people who practiced using his new spoken Hebrew. Yehuda actually taught his son exclusively Hebrew as a child. The lad never learned any other language in his youth. There's even an anecdote of Yehuda getting mad with his wife because his wife would sing the child a Russian nursery rhyme in his crib, and he didn't want any part of that. And that is a way that people do learn. It's a strategy that parents may use to teach their children. And that is something that people can do to try and lock in that language early. But anyways, back to Yehuda with his son just speaking this nascent Hebrew, spoken Hebrew, that made him the very first native speaker of Hebrew in close to 2,000 years. Hebrew as a spoken language became more and more popular in the British Mandate of Palestine during the 19th and 20th centuries. The language brought together the various groups of Jews who didn't necessarily speak a common tongue. European Jews spoke German, French, Russian, Yiddish, Polish. Middle Eastern Jews spoke Ladin, Arabic, Aramaic, and other languages, and Jews from other places spoke other languages altogether. So Hebrew really, it served two purposes. It was a unifying language, and it helped create a common identity. By the time the modern nation of Israel came around, it was natural to make Hebrew the official language. That said, some really wanted Yiddish to be the national tongue. The debate on Yiddish versus Hebrew is its own topic for another day and probably a different podcast altogether. With that bit of background, though, Gil will share how modern spoken Hebrew is changing right before our eyes. It is a story of biblical proportions. Speaking of biblical proportions, make sure you check out Gil's excellent podcast, A Podcast of Biblical Proportions. Now join us as Gil shares his own connections and story of Hebrew. And now a word from our sponsors. I think this is an interesting question. I know a lot of I've interviewed scholars who they know Hebrew and they've learned Hebrew. How much
they learn Hebrew, or are they native speakers?
They learned Hebrew, and like my daughter's school offers Hebrew, and you can learn it. There's Rosetta Stone Hebrew. How much different is the modern Hebrew, and how much has it changed even in the 60, do my math, 70-ish years since it's really become a spoken language in the modern state of Israel? How much has it changed and evolved since the Hebrew of the biblical Hebrew, you might say?
It's a very interesting question. I can compare the generations. Let's say my mom, myself, and my daughter. She's 11. So my mom, the Hebrew that she grew up on was much closer to the biblical. The books that were written back then were written more sternly and gravely, like parts of the Bible, and the translations from other languages into Hebrew had the same style. Because if you want to portray ancient English, not ancient English, but older English, then you would go to Shakespeare. But what we had in Hebrew is just the Bible. So just imagine the Lord of the Rings written in stern, grave Hebrew. Horrible. Don't read it. Don't imagine it. Remind me focus me a little bit. What was your question? You said
the differences between your grandmother or your mother's Hebrew and your daughter's Hebrew.
Oh. So for me, I had to read over and over and over the Bible, that now I feel that I read it, I can understand 95, 99% without looking at the translation, quote unquote, into more modern Hebrew. I was I was reading the Bible with my daughter. She's 11. That was funny. I have this really good version of the Bible with a really good translation next to it, and it's big letters and clear. So she tries to read the biblical Hebrew. It's too hard. So she goes on to read the modern Hebrew translation that is to me very clear, and to her that feels like ancient biblical Hebrew as well. It doesn't feel like the modern Hebrew, intuitive Hebrew that she speaks now, being 11 in 2022. So already you can see the changes, that she's going to have a very different Hebrew than my mom's. And she will never be able to intuitively access the Bible as my mom does. She would have to learn and study. And I don't know if some of that studying you lose part of the organicity,
the intuitiveness of it,
intuitiveness of the literature. If you don't think in those terms, I wonder. I feel like this is the time to figure this shit out, because later it's going to be more difficult. And we have algorithms who can do it. Algorithms found who are the two original QAnoners. And one of them, Stephen, do you know what was his screen name?
No.
Baruch the Scribe.
Oh, that's funny. Now, your daughter's Hebrew, is it that they're coming up with neologisms or new Hebrew words, or is it that they're getting in influences from English and other languages that are changing her Hebrew?
Both. Also, because Hebrew is at its core, it's an ancient language. How many tenses do you have in English? 14? 15?
Yeah, ish. Yes.
Ish.
Yeah.
We have past, present, future, and imperative. So if I want to say, had I known that he would have done that, in Hebrew, you have to invent that new stuff, and some stuff sticks, some doesn't. And a lot of things become simpler. This is something that we know that happens in languages, that, the more stuff that doesn't roll easily off the tongue, expressions, and just a way of expressing yourself just becomes simpler. And so in many ways, old timers complain that we use less verbs and a lot of anglicisms and stuff. Yeah.
And since I have you here, I have to ask this, because this is something that I've been wondering for a long time. And, you can read it in the scholarly books, but it doesn't come across as well when you have to talk to somebody who actually lives it. Yiddish was such a big part. So many of the people who had come from Europe, Yiddish was their language. How many people speak Yiddish anymore in Israel?
My generation doesn't speak Yiddish. My mom speaks Yiddish. My dad, even though he has no Yiddish-speaking people, didn't have any Yiddish-speaking people in his family, understood Yiddish and could converse, simply. And a lot of slang, so much of Israeli slang, more so back in the day than now, was Yiddish. So now we have a lot of common words with German, because Yiddish is like the Jewish German. That's always funny when you find out that all kinds of words, like a sip, or just like let's get down to business. This term, we think that it's very Israeli, and then you're like, no, it's a German word. So now you would have to go to school to study Yiddish, and if you don't have artists who produce art in Yiddish, how long is that going to last?
Yeah. And as once your generation isn't speaking it natively, then poof, that's gone.
That's gone. I know zero. And my mom used to speak with her dad sometimes in Yiddish. It's just like one generation, and it's just erased.
Wow, that's interesting. Wow, we had a whole, I think we talked about just about everything today.
Thank you, Stephen. I always have a blast talking to you. Let's do it more and often.
And now a word from our sponsors. Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast in 10 minutes or less. At least we try. Definitely no more than 15 minutes, but maybe today it's a little different. Imagine a place with serious divisions. Groups around town can't stand each other. They're constantly arguing and pushing for basic rights or more advantage. Often enough, this arguing turns to deadly violence. Welcome to Alexandria, Egypt, in antiquity. This city is the center of the most advanced learning in the world and where modern Christianity and Judaism developed into what we know today. Meanwhile, just up the coast in Palestine, a similar situation is developing. The Roman grip on the area is tight, but the population is stirring. New messianic figures are popping up all the time, and violent uprisings can pop up at any minute. The 1st century AD in southeastern corner of the Mediterranean world was a place and time of intellectual growth, but also incredible social upheaval, and this is the world of Philo of Alexandria, our topic of today. He lived from about 30-ish, 20-ish BCE to about 50 CE. It's a very special time in Jewish, Christian, and Greco-Roman history. Now let's set the stage a little bit for the times that Philo lived. When we're talking about the turn of the BCEs to the CEs, Alexandria was a Greek city in Egypt with a large, powerful Jewish population, which was all controlled by the Romans. It had 2 Jewish quarters out of 5 quarters in the city. And yeah, that's right. Alexandria had 5 quarters. It was so special it had 5 quarters. They call them divisions, but then each group had a quarter. That's not an insignificant population. You know, obviously we can't talk about numbers or anything like that, but it's obviously a lot of people. And in general, there was a huge Jewish diaspora population outside of the traditional Palestine, Judea, Israel area of the Middle East on that coast of the Mediterranean Sea, the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. They were powerful and influential enough that the Greek leaders in Ptolemaic Egypt wanted a translation of the Jewish Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, in which then they produced and founded the Septuagint version of a Greek translation of the Old Testament. And that was a really, really important document back then. If you think about the gospel writers, they quote the Septuagint. They never quote any Hebrew version or older Hebrew version of the Bible that we know of. They're always, whenever Jesus quotes, or the Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the letters, they're always using the Septuagint. And that speaks a lot. There's a lot packed into the fact that that's their go-to translation. Now, the Jewish population in the diaspora, particularly in Alexandria, it was powerful and it had powerful interests. It was wealthy, but it was also a persecuted group. The Jewish diaspora and populace was heaviest in the east, really in the southeast corner of the Mediterranean. As you spread out from there, it sort of thins out into northern Africa. There's Jewish populations, heavy population in Libya, Anatolia, somewhat in Greece. When you start getting to the west and the north, they're more based in the cities. But, and like I said earlier, many of the diaspora Jews, they were Greek. They spoke Greek. They often had Greco-Roman and Jewish names. They were wealthy, educated. They were ingrained into the cities and into the trade networks, but they were always kind of the other. They weren't entirely mainstream. This is the world of Philo Alexandria. He was from a wealthy family. Many of his family members rose to the highest ranks of society, and he was of the priestly class of Second Temple Judaism, but also highly Hellenized. Almost certainly he and his family were Roman citizens, as well as many of the Jewish important families all throughout the diaspora. Think of Paul, that were Roman citizens, yet they weren't completely accepted by the Roman world for a number of reasons. There's only one event from his life that was actually documented, and it's from a book called the Legatio ad Chium, the legation to Caligula. Philo and a legation traveled to Rome to appeal to the emperor for relief from a persecution of the Jews of Alexandria and for Jewish civil rights in Alexandria. And this shows it wasn't necessarily easy to be a Jew of Alexandria and of the diaspora, but they were powerful and influential enough that they could go talk to the Roman emperor and get some relief, and we'll find out what the relief is in not too long. Philo and his Hellenized Jewish position in society is really fascinating, and it's something that we're going to dip in and out of throughout this entire episode. Now, Philo's life's interesting enough. I wish we knew more about it. But his intellectual output is beyond amazing. He used 3 different genres of writings, and I'll describe those 3 genres and then explain them a little bit and give you some examples. It's not an exhaustive list by any means. He had exegetical writings on the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Penta, 5 books. And we often commonly call those the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. He had a book called Questiones e Solutiones in Genesum e Exodum, Questions and Answers in Genesis, which is a 6-part book, so maybe a little bit more than just an FAQ on the Pentateuch. He had historical and apologetic works. He wrote a book on the Therapeutae, which was a book on a Jewish sect called the Therapeutae that lived in Alexandria, and they looked very similar to the Essenes back in Palestine. He also had a really important book that ties back into those persecutions we talked about of the Jews called Contra Flaccum, or Against Flaccus. Flaccus was a governor of Egypt and a family friend of Octavian Caesar, pal to Caesar's kids, the whole thing, like really connected guy, and he was made governor of Egypt. He was appointed there by Tiberius. Flaccus makes a complete mess of Alexandria as governor in the late 30s-ish CE, around the time of Jesus and all the problems brewing not too far away of the Romans in Judea, Palestine area. Flaccus had Jews killed. He kind of turned a blind eye to the populace going and killing Jews, like almost full-blown pogrom going on in Alexandria. Because of that legation, Flaccus was the legation of Philo and important Jews from Alexandria to Rome. Flaccus was eventually removed, exiled, and then even executed. And that's just really the tip of the iceberg of the Jews in Alexandria and the diaspora. And like I said, we're going to keep dipping in and out of their importance. But anyways, Philo also had theological writings, and they add another whole layer to this story, a story that's bigger than Philo, but Philo's a key element of it. He was writing in Greek. He approached the Pentateuch in the Old Testament using Greek philosophical approaches, and a big push in his writing is to examine monotheism through the scriptures using Greek, particularly Platonistic tools. In a way, he's combined Jewish religion with Greek philosophy. He didn't water down his Judaism in any way, and he wasn't syncretizing the religion, with Greek religion. He used Greek philosophy and Greek philosophical tools to expand on Jewish theological issues. Then we get into the idea of the Logos, the Word of God, which is the operating power of God. And Philo really starts to play with this whole idea of the Logos. In the Old Testament, anytime someone's interpreting with God, i.e. the burning bush, many other stories, the way Philo presents it is they're dealing with the Logos. The Logos is God, but something different than God himself, the transcendent God. It's sometimes referred to as the shadow of God, the creator of all things. And it's derived from a Greek philosophical concept, and different Greek philosophical schools viewed the Logos differently. The Logos was viewed as something like reason, or the many different ways, and it gets very into the weeds of Greek philosophy of the way all these different schools, but they all had some idea of the logos. And as we're very much brushing over the logos here, it's a very complicated topic, and scholars today often say that Philo purposefully made his Jewish view on the logos very complicated. And I have a feeling that we'll revisit the logos in future episodes as well. Now, the big idea is Philo thought about the ideas of God the Father, the transcendent God, the logos, as an intermediary, and then something of the Holy Spirit. He didn't exactly come to the conclusions that the Christians did, but the Christians borrowed and plugged into this thought. And Philo wasn't exactly a proto-Christian, but Philo got the ball rolling on ideas that really stuck with the Christians, who are they're starting to think these ideas out almost contemporary to Philo. If Philo died in the 50s, Paul's writing in the 50s, but even into the next generation of thinkers, they're all using this, and not even the next generation of thinkers, generation upon generation of thinkers are thinking about Philo and using Philo. I'd love to know if Philo and Paul ever crossed paths. Probably not, but that would be an interesting concept. A little maybe speculative historical fiction might be in there. There's another major influence of Philo on the early Alexandrine Greek Christians, his use of allegorical interpretations of the Old Testament. Philo was highly influential on the Alexandrine school of theology. Origen of Alexandria, Clement of Alexandria, the catechetical school of Alexandria. Alexandria was the powerhouse of early Christian thought, and the thought leaders of this school were influenced by Philo's writings. And I've kind of said this along the way, but Philo really, really reminds me in a lot of ways of Paul of Tarsus. Paul lived in an almost exact milieu that Philo did, member of a connected priestly Jewish Roman Greco-Roman family, a Roman citizen, highly educated. Paul was from southern Anatolia, but also in this whole idea of the Jewish diaspora. And diaspora Jews were all over the Mediterranean world. And in a way, they were kind of different than their Palestinian, Judean, Galilean brethren. They felt a kinship to their co-religionists back home, you might say, but there was also a conflict of who was the real group, who were really the thought leaders, who should follow whose lead. And this was a conflict in the very earliest of Christianity that Paul was involved in. You have Paul versus James the Just, brother of Jesus. How should the Jewish law be interpreted in a Christian context? What customs should be followed? Who should be the leadership? And a huge question that was simmering in Second Temple Judaism since the time before Christianity is the diaspora in the Greco-Roman diaspora in conflict with the homegrown, you might say, Judaism of actual Jerusalem and its environs. All this wasn't even all just in the Jewish house, so to speak. Judaism was getting noticed by the larger Greco-Roman world with the God-fearers, hearers. There's a lot of different names, and there was kind of a spectrum of people, of pagans who were interested in Judaism, going all the way from joining up and actually converting to just going to the synagogue services and following along, to even being influenced by Judaism and taking some of these ideas of Second Temple Judaism, early Christianity, and borrowing it, and you might even say copying it into their pagan practices. We see that with Sol Invictus a little bit later, and you can't say that early Christianity and the Judaism of the Second Temple was just copycatting everywhere else. There was a lot of influence because these were such influential and powerful religions that groups were looking and saying, hey, this isn't so bad, let's try this. And there's evidence for this all over the place. Philo of Alexandria, he doesn't give us a window into this era. I think he kicks the wall down so that we can actually see inside of what was going on in early 1st century CE religion and practice and early Christianity and early Judaism and late Second Temple Judaism. It's fascinating. The conflicts, the arguments inside of Second Temple Judaism. We could also see how Christianity spread so quickly. It had fertile ground to grow in. Jews in the diaspora they were open to the ideas of the Pauline, more Hellenized version of Christianity that was being developed and refined. Pagans who were inclined towards Judaism could go in and feel really easily comfortable in one of these early Jesus clubs we talk about. There's evidence in the way Christianity spread geographically. The places where the Jewish diaspora was densest in the East was where Christianity was the most populous and most deeply ingrained in the Roman Empire. If we fast forward to maybe the early 300s, 4th century, the East is where Christianity mostly was. As we go west, there's less and less Christianity, especially the places where you really see Christianity are in the big cities that would have had a Jewish diaspora in them. That's where they're sinking in. Where Christianity's not sinking in is in these country areas, the Pagani, the home of the pagans. Pagani meaning country folks. This is where Christianity's not seeping into as much, and it takes almost centuries for Christianity to soak into these areas that didn't have a Jewish, Second Temple Jewish, Greco-Roman Hellenized population, or the God-fearers and the hearers who wanted to learn more about Judaism. The less cosmopolitan and the less Eastern, meaning less of the Jewish diaspora, the less Christians until centuries later. Philo shows us the intellectual framework for early Christianity, and there was a way for them to develop, and this whole thing was thoroughly in existence during the Second Temple Judaism period that Christianity grew out of. The idea that somehow Christianity just syncretized Greco-Roman paganism and essentially abandoned all of Second Judaism and its roots to become a Roman religion, it makes no sense at all if you look at it through the lens of Philo Alexandria and the Second Temple Hellenized Jewish diaspora. Although Philo of Alexandria was not a Christian in any way, he lived at just about the most critical time in the development of Christianity, and his influence can be seen throughout the entire history of Christianity, the church, and without a doubt, the history of the popes of Rome. And that's it for this piece of Papal and Church History in 10 minutes or less, and I would love to hear your thoughts, comments, and feedback on this, especially some of it's a little controversial, but I'd love to hear what you think about it, and there's definitely plenty of opportunity to discuss things from this episode. I want to thank all of our patrons on patreon.com/History of the Papacy podcast. You really help keep all of this going. That's the place if you want to hear these sorts of episodes first, so I will talk to you next time.